To introduce Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, I'm going to talk about the family memoir. I'm going to talk first about the traditional family memoir, and then I will talk about Kingston's particular version of the family memoir, ultimately focusing on how Maxine Hong Kingston, The Woman Warrior, is experimental in many ways, but one way it is experimental is that it is a collage of genres, not one genre or another, but several genres melded together, fused together. Well, some of the great memoirs of all time are family memoirs. What do I mean by that? They're memoirs that explore a particular family relationship. Sometimes it's between a parent, a particular parent, mother or dad, and a child. Sometimes it's about the child in connection with a larger community. Sometimes the family memoir can be by a parent in relation to a child, just a memoir that explores any kind of family relationship. Obviously, almost any memoir is going to have family playing a role in one way or another, but the family memoir just foregrounds the family relations as a major shaping force of the author of that particular memoir. So, some famous family memoirs. One we will be reading later this semester, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. A father is writing a long letter to his son. Another one by Nicholas Flynn, another bullshit night in Suck City, about a young man struggling to get to know his father, to find his father, who is often homeless. If you recall, we read an excerpt from that memoir earlier in the semester. Let's see some others. Running with Scissors by Augustin Burroughs, about his very unorthodox upbringing by both his mother and some rather off-the-wall guardians. It's a very funny book to read. Tobias Wolff, This Boy's Life, Mary Karr, The Liars Club. Yeah, that's a good list there. The traditional family memoir, like the traditional memoir in general, usually features at least four elements. One, the memoir is often told exclusively in first person, from the point of view of the I, that who is exploring selfhood. And for this reason, the events that take place in the narrative are seen through the eyes of this first person narrator. Typically, this is the second element, the traditional family memoir, like the traditional memoir, is linear. It tells a story over time, over the development of time, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, with causality being the driving force. Because this happened, that happened next, and so on and so forth. Usually in the family memoir, there's a clear conflict, a clear antagonist against which the primary character struggles. It could be a father or a mother. It could be one's own understanding of the father or the mother. But there tends to be a clear conflict, a clear tension that is worked out in the course of the book. And above all, the family memoir is assumed to be nonfiction. It is usually grounded in the everyday world that most of us experience, albeit subjectively, but the ordinary world, what we could call the empirical world, the world that we grasp with our five senses. Now, the Woman Warrior pushes against all four of these conventions. First of all, even though the memoir begins in first person with Kingston, we'll call her, telling about how her mother recounted the story of an aunt, the no-name woman who committed adultery in a small Chinese village, and the tragedy that ensued. We soon move away from that particular first person, a traditional first person, to a first person that is not Maxine Hong Kingston, but is a mythical warrior, Fa Mulan. So we're no longer in the world of, okay, I'm seeing the world through one particular point of view. There is an I, but it's another I entirely, telling me about a world that isn't quite different from the world of the traditional narrator, Kingston. Moreover, we often see, well, in one particular case, I should say, In Kingston's book, we move from first person to third person. At the Western Gate is told from a third person point of view. Of course, it's told about a time during which Kingston herself was not even born. So there's a shift there too that problematizes that traditional convention of the family memoir, the traditional family memoir. Linear. Well, the book is not linear at all, is it? Is it? It begins with Kingston as a child being told a story by her mother, and then the book moves into this mythological realm in White Tigers. But then it moves in the third chapter, Shaman, to the history of her mother back in China before Kingston was even born. And then we move to a history, and at the Western Gate, of a time in America before Kingston was around. So we begin at a certain point in history, then we move to a realm that is outside of history, let's say, and then we move to a realm that precedes the personal history of the author of the book. Clear antagonist, protagonist? Not really. So we could say, okay, well, the antagonist is the mother, because the mother holds a certain set of values, certain standards of excellence that she constantly projects into her daughter, and the daughter struggles against these. So the mother is an enemy in some sense, but also the mother's an ally, because the mother's courage in breaking away from tradition in her own Chinese village and becoming a midwife, a doctor, as it were, inspires the author herself to break from her own Chinese American community in the United States and forge her own path as well. We could say, well, maybe America is an antagonist. Certainly it is to the mother to a certain extent. The mother is respected in China. She comes to America. She loses all her medical credentials and has to be a laundress and struggle with a very difficult life. And she calls Americans ghosts. They're not real, whereas China was real. However, for Kingston, America is real, and the past, the Chinese past of her mother, that is the realm of ghosts. So America has that duplicity as well. So it's very much a book, a multi-perspectival book that suggests any given event, if you look at it from more than one perspective, takes on a deep and resonant ambiguity. And we see this with the No-Name Woman as well. To the mother, the no-name woman has certain meanings. It's a warning to her daughter not to get pregnant outside of wedlock. But to Kingston, it's a way to start thinking about relationships between the community and her aunt, in which the aunt is seen as more victim than a perpetrator of ill. And finally, this book is not clearly nonfiction at all. Initially, Kingston thought about publishing the book under another title. I don't quite remember. It's something like Tales from the Golden Mountain. That's not it. But she imagined it as a collection of short stories, essentially, because certainly the stories are blends of fact and fiction. But the book publisher said, no, collections of stories don't do that well. Let's market it as nonfiction, and we can even call it a memoir in the subtitle. So Kingston imagines it as nonfiction, but again, a lot of the book comes from the realm of the talk story, and the talk story is a kind of blend of fact and fiction, reality and myth. So the whole book is a long talk story, and as such, it is a blend of straight up memoir. But also, we see in it histories that can be interpreted more than one way. We see in it events that the narrator herself could not have seen. We see in it, again, mythological elements, poetic elements that seem to have nothing to do with the everyday world. So the book is finally a collage of genres. It is nonfiction, it is fiction, it is myth, it is history, it is cultural analysis, it is prose poetry, it is all these things. So what's the effect of these experiments and these undercuttings of traditional family memoir? Well, there are many. I'll talk about one or two right now. We'll go into this more in class tomorrow. Um, so Kingston, as a Chinese American writing in the 70s, and from a family of Chinese Americans who immigrated over from China, occupied a place that was marginalized. She was not in a position of sort of a mainstream American, someone born in America, say. And as a woman, she was not in a place of cultural power at a time when patriarchy was a stronger force than it is now, especially in the Chinese tradition from which Kingston and her mother came. There's a sense that women have a certain role and men have a certain role. So, as someone who's occupying a marginalized cultural position, and as someone who's occupying a gender position that was not necessarily mainstream at the time, that sense of the emphatic subjectivity, the emphatic I, is not there in Kingston's life. So it makes sense that she would think about identity as more fluid. Identity as not something necessarily set off from the community, but very much haunted by the community. You cannot think of the I without thinking about the collective. But not only that, thinking about the I as not simply within one person's flesh, but the I as manifesting in dream, the I as manifesting in myth, in talk story. So this fluid I is on the one hand a way to capture the kind of ambiguity of Kingston's place in American culture in the 70s, but also it opens up aesthetic possibilities that the more traditional I might foreclose. Again, the exploration of several genres to express the I, the idea that the I is multifaceted and can be expressed in many different forms. So I think that's enough. That's really just one way to think about the rhetoric, as it were, of the collage of genres. So I'll see you tomorrow.